is set up. I'm just going to do kind of a brief introduction to the subject this morning, and then what we're going to do is that we're going to go to the kitchen area, and then Mercy will do a food demonstration so that you'll be able to eat it for lunch. And then this afternoon we'll go over maybe a few more details and just progress. And in the afternoon, I'll talk more about the spiritual applications of some things. Okay? So how many of you here have never heard of Mercy or myself before? A few people. Okay, very good. So I'll just introduce ourselves. My name is Joyce Choe, and I'm an ophthalmologist in Washington State. I'm here with Mercy Ballard. Hello. I know Juanita Kreshmar from years ago. She made a huge impact on my life, so I'm so blessed to be here with her family. And so, hello, Jeannie. So today we're going to talk about the health message and then our testimony on how the health message has impacted our lives. I'm going to share with you right now case studies of intensive interventions in lifestyle medicine, and we'll have a lot more of these types of experiences. Okay, so you're going to be familiar with some of these quotes. This one from Manuscript Releases: "The work to be done by our sanitariums is to labor for the salvation of the men and women who come for treatment." Isn't that interesting? When we think of sanitarium work, the first thing that we want to do is to share with them Jesus. Amen? To bring men and women to a belief of the truth is the work which is to be done by all our institutions. If this cannot be done in our sanitariums, why should we be at the expense of erecting them? And actually, there's a quote in the Spirit of Prophecy about our schools that says pretty much the same thing about our schools, that if they are not accomplishing this purpose, that they should be sold and that we should start all over again. Very interesting, isn't it? Our institutions were established that the sick may be treated by hygienic methods, discarding almost entirely the use of drugs. Now, when I was going through medical school, I was reading through some books by an Adventist physician, and the impression that I took away from it was that the drugs that Sister White was talking about were the heavy metals and some of the more harmful drugs that were used in her day. And it wasn't until I went to a lifestyle center after I finished my training and I was already in practice that I realized that a lot of the writings of Sister White, that I could apply the same principles to the drugs that were being used today. You know what I'm saying? Now, sometimes when people read things like this, they think that we are being too extreme when we say that we want to try to treat diseases without drugs as much as possible. But this quote does not say that we should discard almost entirely the use of drugs until there are better drugs. Does it say that? No, it just says that we should learn how to treat people so with natural means until we don't need to use drugs very much at all, okay? So I'm not saying that there is never a place for drugs, but this should be the goal of the Adventist physician. The Adventist physician was challenged to seek altogether new methods of treating the sick. Amen? I think God will bless. So now we're going to talk a little bit about autoimmune disease, and then I'll tell you a little bit about ourselves as we go into this talk. And the reason that we're talking about autoimmune disease is because this was something that impacted Mercy, and the food sensitivities, the leaky gut aspect of it was something that I struggled with, and a lot of people are struggling with right now. How many of you, when you were growing up, didn't know anybody who had autoimmune disease, right? And now all of a sudden, it's like almost everybody you talk to is having some kind of food sensitivity. Almost everyone that you talk to has some kind of arthritic problem and is having to think altogether differently about how to live. So we see that autoimmune disease is on the rise. Estimates of the yearly increases in the overall worldwide incidence and prevalence of autoimmune disease is 19.1% and 12.5%. And so incidence just means new cases, and prevalence just means how many cases there are. And so you can see that both are on the rise quite a bit. 19.1% a year, that's incredible. So they were just looking at anti-nuclear antibodies, which is a type of autoantibody. It's an antibody that is formed against the body itself. And they found that in 1988 to 1991, there were 11% or 22 million affected individuals. It doesn't mean necessarily that they're going to have symptoms, right? You can have autoantibodies and not necessarily have symptoms, and you can have symptoms and not necessarily have autoantibodies, but it gives you some indication that there is something going on when you do see an increase in autoantibodies. Now, 1999 to 2004, 11.5% or 27 million. Isn't it amazing? Only 0.5% increase, and yet you have 5 million more people who are affected. And then 2011 to 2012, 15.9% or 41 million individuals. So you can see every year there is a significant increase in number of people who are being affected by this problem. And the problem is, I think it's 12 to 20-year-olds. So it was a teenage group that increased nearly threefold over the study period. That's very concerning. Now, according to Dr. Alessio Fasano, who is a researcher at Harvard, his laboratory discovered that there were three things that, well, this was what he concluded from what his lab had discovered. And that was that there are three things that are needed for you to develop autoimmune disease, and probably many of these chronic conditions. Number one, you need a genetic predisposition. So if you come from a family that has some kind of chronic issue, whether it is an autoimmune disease or IBS or something like that, and then you also need to have an inflammatory trigger, and then gut permeability, which is loss of gut barrier mechanisms. So we'll talk a little bit about those things. So the inflammatory trigger will also get into the genetic predisposition accounts for nearly 30% of all autoimmune diseases. The rest, or 70%, are due to environmental factors, including toxic chemicals, dietary components, gut dysbiosis, and infections. Now, the environment plays a huge role. Did you know that, how many of you here have allergies? That's a huge number of people that have allergies. And it wasn't until the 1800s that there was a British doctor that went before the British Medical Association and told a case report of someone who had itchy eyes and runny nose and this kind of thing. And everybody was like, whoa, what is this mysterious thing? We'll call this hay fever. And it was because that the Industrial Revolution was happening and there was so much pollution coming into the environment. And so now we see that because of this disruption to the way that the body works, that the body is not able to tolerate dirt and dust and things that we should be able to tolerate. You see the importance of having a clean environment for a healthy body. So what are some inflammatory triggers that can trigger these issues? Pharmaceutical drugs, vaccines, oral contraceptives, hormone replacement therapy, infections. I think this is an area that is not looked into very much. I was just talking with Dr. Arvo yesterday about things like MS and you know, some of these really mysterious things. A lot of times we will treat the symptom, like the neurological development, and we will not look to see, is there an underlying chronic infection that the person is dealing with. I had a spinal cord injury 3 years ago, and when that happened, I went to see a chiropractor who was also, she was more of just, you know, someone who, a lot of chiropractors, they'll do alternative care, do supplements and this kind of thing. And as she was working through my body, she said, you know, you have some lymph nodes that are enlarged. And she asked me about Epstein-Barr, and she did some studies, and sure enough, the trauma had caused my immune system. I didn't realize this. I just, you know, because when you have injury, I think you go into a bit of shock and that kind of thing. Well, I had massive Epstein-Barr virus reactivation, and so a lot of people, you kind of get used to just not feeling good, and you don't realize how bad you feel until you feel better. So for those of you who are just not doing very well and you're suffering from some, you know, like fatigue and this kind of thing, I would get a good, you know, set of labs done, including things like Epstein-Barr and cytomegalovirus and these types of things, and see if there's any opportunistic viruses that are coming out of dormancy. Toxins, mold, pesticides, plastics, heavy metals, hair dyes, cosmetics, and body care ingredients. When I first started doing this, I went to a convention, and there was a pathologist who asked me what I was doing, and I told him about how, you know, we dealt with food sensitivities and this type of thing, and he said, you know, I had psoriatic arthritis, and I got some testing done, and I found out I was not sensitive to any foods, but I was sensitive to plastic. And once I got the plastic out of my life, the psoriatic arthritis went away. And so for those of you who are drinking water using a lot of plastic bottles and storing your food in plastic and this kind of thing, I would just really try to minimize my exposure to plastic as much as possible. We also try to do things as naturally as possible, including when we're cleaning the house. We're trying to use things that are not full of chemicals. You can do a lot with vinegar and baking soda and this type of thing. And even the cosmetics, we try to minimize exposure. Like, you know, there are 2,000 new chemicals that are being released into the environment every year. 2,000. And they're not required to test them for human safety before they put them into your cosmetics, into your furniture, your clothing, and this kind of thing. And so we want to minimize exposure to that as much as possible. Nutrition, preservatives, emulsifiers, thickeners, vinegar, pickled food, and gluten. Some of you are going to wonder about gluten. Really, is gluten a problem? And I'm going to talk about that, especially for people who are struggling with their health. Stress. 80% of those who have been diagnosed with an autoimmune condition can recall some major stress that happened at around the time of their diagnosis. And so that just shows you just how much of an inflammatory trigger this can be. It's so important. This is why we really need Jesus. You can't just follow a recipe. We really, really need Jesus for us to heal. Lifestyle practices, lack of sleep, lack of exercise, lack of sunlight, lack of fresh air. So all of these things can be inflammatory triggers. I do want to share about the vaccines because I have this in our cookbook, and when we first published the cookbook, there was we got in touch with some people about doing podcasts, and there was a vegetarian podcaster who agreed to have us on his show. And then when he read through the book, we had this discussion. He said, I noticed that you have vaccines as possible inflammatory triggers. He said, haven't we established that vaccines are safe and effective? And I said, well, that may be that it is considered to be that way, but we have seen people who have had an autoimmune diagnosis after they had vaccines. And so this was way, way before, you know, this was like 5 years ago or something like that. We had a long discussion about this, and then he said, I'm sorry, I can't have you on my show because it's not scientific enough for you to think that. And so I just think, you know, I just want to share that with you, just that in the medical field even years ago, even if you were to observe something to be the result of a vaccine, say back then, it was it was considered not an observation. It was considered non-scientific, even at that point. And so I just would have us to caution that we really want to be careful that we're not just saying something is scientific simply because popular culture or even medicine says that it's scientific. We want to follow the truth and observation, and especially the Bible and the spirit of prophecy and inspiration. Amen? So as far as gut permeability, this happens when you have compromised tight junctions. Tight junctions in the intestinal tract, they are simply the connections that your intestinal cells have with each other. It's kind of like if you're standing in a circle holding hands. Okay, if I'm holding hands with someone, it's going to be much more difficult for someone to try to break into my circle, right? Than if I'm just standing shoulder to shoulder without holding hands, right? So those tight junctions serve as like holding hands between the cells. And you can lose those tight junctions, and when you do, you'll have larger undigested food molecules, you'll have bacteria, foreign particles getting into the body